Yesterday I dropped in a post requesting for questions which I can answer it today. Lots of you had posted lots of questions in YouTube community and also in the Twitter page. I'll be answering them now. Wherever I feel that I can show you some code, I will be showing you that. So if you have not dropped any questions previously, you can drop those questions in this particular video. I'll answer that in the next video, or I'll be answering it by replying to your comments. So let's jump on to the first question. Press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss any update from Tech Primers. The first one is from Shivam, who asked it in Twitter. So he has asked, is there any way to configure data source at runtime and tell JPA repository to use a particular data source using annotations or any other way? This is regarding the Spring Boot data JPA. So what Shivam is asking is, he wants to use two different data sources for a same JPA repository. He's using Data JPA inside a Spring Boot application. So this is a very good question when you want to solve connectivity to two different databases, or when you have two different data sources and you want to use the same data repository, right? So I don't have time to show you with the code, but I got a very good article from medium.com. So Shivam, you can go ahead and look at this particular link. I'll drop that in the description below, so you can go and check this particular link. I'll basically explain what is done here so that it's easy for you to understand, and you can directly in fact start and try it out. In this particular example, they have showed connectivity to Oracle DB and Postgres SQL. So there are two different data sources. How Spring works is it uses the concept of entity manager, and the entity manager is used to build a data source, right? And if you see here, we don't have any configurations by default because we are using only one data source. However, when you are creating multiple data source, you will have to create a primary data source, secondary, and additional stuff, right? So you will be using custom configurations like how it is done here. So you will be enabling the entity manager configuration. So you'll be creating a entity manager factory bean and then providing the data source whatever we created here. And if you see here, by default this data source is loaded from the configuration spring.datasource. So all the configurations related to this will be loaded. So spring.datasource.url, spring.datasource, all these configurations will be used in that particular data source creation. So first we create a primary data source with this particular information, and next we create a data source with bar.datasource. So how will we know that? So we will have to create another set of entity manager bean, because we need to provide that data source as well, right? And you can see here we provide the configuration prefix here saying go and take it from bar.datasource. So that way Spring loads this particular property into this data source, and it will be used for the JPA repositories which are under this particular directory. So we have to have multiple packages in order to support data sources, right? So see here we have a package called bar.repo, and here we will have a different package foo.repo. So the repositories, basically the JPA repositories which you create, should be in different folder. That way Spring has by default created and loaded these into its configuration, so that way you can flip it. And how will you use it? So when you are using it in the code, see here, right, you will be injecting both these repositories and you can directly use them. So I guess you might be having a if condition or some set of rules. Based on that you are going to decide the data source or the repository, right? So you can create different repositories based on your data sources and then use that particular repository wherever it is required. I hope this particular example will be very helpful. Do check that out, Shivam. The next question is from Sandeep. So Sandeep is asking, hi Tech Primers, you're amazing. Thank you, Sandeep. I have completed 2 years of my career working with Spring MVC Hibernate, now planning to switch the job. The question is, should I go for Spring Boot learning or data structure? As I am very weak in data structure, please give me an advice. Thank you. Obviously, I get it. You started working on Spring MVC and you know Spring Boot, but the basis for processing something, when you want to write processing logic and when you move ahead in your career, right? So when you want to do heavy lifting operations, when you're working for transactions and processing systems, then data structures will play a key part, because you need to store your processing data somewhere inside the memory, right? So that is when design patterns inside data structure will be helpful, and you will have to definitely learn it in future if you are going to stay a technical person. So I would suggest go first with data structures. I'm not saying that go and learn something like binary search tree, how to split a binary search tree or something like that, but get to know all the basics of data structures. What are data structures, how you can use different data structures, and something like that. Try out some basic examples of data structures. There are very good channels inside YouTube itself. I don't take any data structures video, but there are other channels which you can check for data structure specific videos. Parallelly, you can go for Spring Boot learning as well, because Spring Boot is a framework, right now Spring Boot is the key, but later on maybe some other framework might come into picture, right? So I would suggest learn both. Data structure should be your key, because that will act as a basis for all your processing in future. So the next question is from Amrita. So Amrita is asking, hi sir. Hi Amrita. Kindly help me understand static synchronized method versus non-static synchronized method. So I wrote a small program to demonstrate and when each will be used, right? So here I have a class called sync example, which has two methods. One is called the print static, the other is called the print non-static. And if you see here, this method is static and synchronized, and this particular method is only synchronized. If you're trying to access a static method, so how do we generally access, right? When you're trying to access a static method, we generally say the object dot static. So what we are doing here is we are not creating a object or an instance or a handler to that particular class, right? We are not creating a reference to this particular class. However, we are directly using the sync example dot print static to directly access that particular method. So what happens in the JVM is, when you are having a static method, even without creating a memory for this particular object, it creates a space for this particular method. So which basically means you don't have to create an object of this particular instance to access this particular method. So that is what is the basic difference between a static and a non-static variable or a method, right? So that is what happens here as well. So when you're using this in a multi-threaded context, so for example, the block which is not static, this block will not be created until you do a new. So until I do a new object and then call this particular method, I won't be able to get a handle of this particular method. So whenever you are using it in a multi-threaded environment, where let's say you have multiple threads using different operations or different objects, in that case, let's say they are using different versions of sync example. That way, a static block would help, so that even though there are different instances of the sync example, this particular method is always synchronized. So that way, even though the objects are different, this particular method will be synchronized across all these threads because it is static. However, let's say if the same threads are accessing print non-static and it is synchronized, but it will not get synchronized across the threads because the threads are using different instances of sync example. So the synchronize will be void when there are different instances, and if it is synchronized, the scope of synchronize will lie within this particular class or within that particular instance. However, when you say static, it applies for all the static calls, so irrespective of any instance of the sync object you are using. And most of the time we use directly from the class, right? We don't use sync example dot print static. See, IntelliJ doesn't show me that option as well, because that's a violation. If I use it, I can use it, but IntelliJ will show me as a violation, right? Saying static member accessed via instance variable. So you shouldn't do that ideally. So that is when non-static and static varies. The next question is from Ashish. Hi Ashish. I'm unable to understand blocking queue in context of multi-threading. Kindly help me in this. So same way I have another example which I had written. So this is a small example which I wrote. If you're familiar, Java has Java util.concurrent package, which has a concept of queue, and there are different queues. Blocking queue is an interface, and there is a blocking DQ as well, right? So if you see here, this in this example, what I have done is I have just created a blocking queue, and I have array blocking queue, which is basically a queue which has array. of size 10. I have given the size as 10, and I'm just saying add. So add is nothing but it is just putting this particular message onto the queue, and when I do a get, it is basically taking. So this is a single threaded application. So what's happening is the same thread is just adding the string and then getting it out, right? That's what I'm doing here. I'm not doing anything fancy, right? However, if you see in a multi-threaded environment, when you use blocking queues, there will be one thread which will be adding elements to the queue, and there will be one thread which will be taking elements out of the queue. But how will the thread which is taking elements out of the queue know that okay, there are elements in the queue, right? That is when blocking queue is helpful, where the queue will be helping the consumers or the producers to control the queue. In this example, I have a queue size of 10. Let's say there is one thread which is adding lots of elements into the queue, and if the queue is full, so if the queue is full, the thread which is pushing in the values will be blocked because the queue is full. Until the queue is emptied, the values will not be pushed inside the queue. So that is the example of a producer side blocking queue. Let's say from the consumer side, right? The consumer is trying to consume messages of this queue. Let's say it has consumed all the 10 messages and there are no elements in the queue. So the blocking queue will help you in blocking the thread until a element arrives in the queue. So this block queue.take will not get any value until there is an element inside this particular queue. So this is generally used in the multi-threading concept, where we are having heavy operations and you want to have a queue in between two different processings. That is when you will use blocking queue. If you want to see a real-time documentation example, go to the Java documentation itself. If I go to the interface, there is a very good documentation which says the similar stuff, right? See this particular example. So there is a blocking queue with some implementation. There is a producer, there are different consumers. Producer is a separate thread, consumers are all different threads. All these will be different threads because you want to perform a heavy operation from the producer, and the consumer wants to consume these messages and do some other heavy operation. So you don't want to make them go into a same thread because both are heavy operations. A typical example would be the producer is reading messages from a socket, or it is reading messages from a HTTP endpoint. And if you want to read messages faster, you just go and read it and then just put it into a blocking queue. So there are consumer threads which can just take it from the blocking queue and persist into a database, or it can maybe even publish onto a different HTTP endpoint, or even publish onto a JMS queue. See this particular example, right? The producer and the consumer classes are basically just writing messages onto the queue and even consuming messages from the queue. So this is exactly the scenario which I just explained you a few minutes ago. So I hope you understood what is a blocking queue in terms of multi-threaded context. And mostly blocking queues will be used in the multi-threaded context only, because you want to block a thread. If you want to block a thread, obviously everything will be stuck. So when do we block a thread? When you have multiple threads, right? So that is when blocking queues are helpful. So the next question is from Sharon. Sharon is asking, what tools do you use for editing? It's really nice. There is no specific tool as such. I use lots of tools. The final video is all merged using iMovie. So if you see, this laptop is a Mac, so I use iMovie. Right now I cannot open it because I have only 500 MB RAM and it will crash. You can check out my video on how do I edit videos. Then I create the thumbnails in a different software called Canva. Then the intro rolling part where the text comes in, right, with the black um, background and all those stuff, right? So that I created with a software called Legend in my mobile, and then I move it to the laptop, and then finally I merge all these in iMovie, right? It took some time for me to come up with this particular template, whatever you guys are seeing in all these recent videos. Initially, when you saw the first video, it was different. I just learned lots of things over a period of time, and then I finally have come up with a template. And I have some list of musics which are no copyright music, and then I use them. I just edit them. So it takes around like half an hour to 1 hour to edit one particular video, depending on the size of the video, and it takes a while to export these videos as well, right? So after I edit, these needs to be merged and finally created as a final version. So that takes around I think 1 minute for 1 minute equivalent of second. So let's say there is a 30-minute video, it takes 30 minutes to export that video or something like that. So those are the tools which I use for editing. So the next question is from Nitin. Nitin has lots of questions which are related to microservices. The first question is it correct to say the strategy should be to have 10 Docker instances with each instance having its own DB, app server, and its own jar, different application? So yes, so that is the ideal world scenario, but I don't think everyone does that. Right? Many people go ahead with saying, okay, I have three different microservices. I'll just put all these three different microservices into three different instances, but they might be talking to the same database. So people still do that, but ideally they shouldn't do that. As you said, if there are 10 different Docker instances and 10 different applications which are independent, then it's better to have its own database instance. What is the difference between microservices and modularization? For example, modularization, I have different channels where the traffic comes like mobile web. If the channels are independent and do not cross with each other, and then I can split my application based on the channel. As a part of modularization, any enhancement in one channel can be developed, deployed separately and won't affect other channel. However, microservices, I can create different services which can be used by different channels. We can integrate Eureka, Zool, Kafka, but question is when adding these are really required. If my services are not going to talk to each other, then do I require them or can I skip? So there is a common misconception about microservices and modularization, right? So microservices is just a design pattern, right? Nobody is going to say you should use this way or you shouldn't be using it this way, right? Same way with modularization. Modularization is also a kind of design pattern. However, microservices are useful when you have a domain specific logic which is implemented in a service. However, modularization doesn't have to be domain specific, right? Modularization could be where, let's say I see a reusable component inside my code base. What I do is I create a separate module, so that can be used inside different modules, right? So that is what modularization is. Microservices also applies to a little bit of modularization, but that's not the primary goal of microservices, right? Microservices goal is doing a particular job and only that particular job. Modularization is not same as microservice. It is useful for creating microservices application. So they both go hand in hand, if you ask me. And you should know when to use modularization concept and when to use microservices concept. So modularization concept is not same as microservices concept, right? Modularization doesn't talk about resiliency, the design patterns of how calls needs to be done and stuff like that. Modularization is just managing your code base or application, right? That is what modularization mean. Microservices is beyond that. Do we really need to make architecture microservices based if you know that traffic is going to be like isn't going to be like Flipkart, Amazon, Google? As per my understanding, trade-off for microservices isn't really good if traffic is not going to be huge and does not require high availability. Yeah, as you said, yes, you don't have to go for microservices always. So you can be happy with a monolithic application and stay happy forever. Microservices is used when you have too much of traffic, as you said. If you want to scale some parts of the application and not the complete part of the application, then you don't have to go for microservices. But nowadays lots of people overdo stuff by going to microservices and then they burn their hand by not able to manage these applications, because once you split applications to into microservices, there is additional overhead of managing these independently. So yeah, there is no point in just going for microservices just for the sake of it. What is your opinion if I have 5 different services in 5 different languages or stacks? So if you have 5 different services in 5 different languages or stacks, they should be okay, because that is what microservices gives as a design, because you can define what language I should use for that particular processing. But the only thing is, as a single team, if you see, managing these 5 services might be difficult. Learning 5 different languages might be difficult from a developer's perspective, right? But many people don't understand this concept of microservices. That's why they say, okay, I have 15 microservices, I'll just have all these managed by a single team, even though I have like 10 different technology stacks. That's not how microservices work. If you read a definition of microservice by Jeff Bezos, he says that a microservice is team a team of microservice developers will be able to be fed by 2 pizzas, right? So that is what he says about microservices. I have seen lots of teams which are overdoing microservices with too many microservices, but that's not the right thing, in my opinion. The next question is from Nitish. Nitish says, hi Nitish. If I want to build a ERP, can you please tell which all very latest technologies do I need to use? I guess you mean enterprise resource planning, right, for ERP. And what are the different technologies you can use? In fact, ERP is a wider term. For example, you have lots of existing tools. For CRM there are different tools. For human resources there are different tools. For inventory management there are different tools. For financial management there are different tools, and same way for sales management, right? But if let's say you're creating all these with a new technology, obviously you should go for the latest technology. For example, let's say if you're going to create an inventory service, obviously you will go for Angular or React for the UI part, and then you can go for uh, Spring Boot or Vertex or any backend microservices architecture or a framework. And obviously you will go for any cloud platform. So depending on your business needs, you will have to choose these. I cannot directly say what all very latest technologies you can use, but if you had seen from my channel, those are the latest technologies which are there currently. But based on your business need, you will have to choose, because ERP is a very big domain where you have everything in place, because it's like managing the whole business, right? So you will have to choose what domain you wanted and what kind of technology you wanted based on the volume as well. So I cannot directly say that okay, go for MongoDB or go for um, Elasticsearch or something like that. I cannot throw in some jargons for you, but if you are interested in looking for a specific domain implementation inside ERP, then let me know. I can just answer that. But in general, you can see all the latest technologies in the channel. The next question is again from Amrita. Amrita says, can you please answer below question as well? Debugging wrong output from a web service. I'm not sure how will I debug it. In general, what do you do if there is a web service which you have and you're going to debug an output? Okay, in general you're asking how do you debug, right? So in general I do write integration tests most of the time, right? Or in fact you can have cucumber tests. So I have seen lots of teams who don't even have integration and cucumber tests, they just write unit test, and that also just for the sake of coverage, right? But you can have cucumber and integration test which can find out all these kind of bugs whenever you need, and you can run it locally. So most of the time we face challenges when you are not able to test, right? When you are deployed, when you have deployed it in the dev environment or a UAT environment or something like that. So in general I would suggest test it, try testing it locally. So try creating a test which you can run locally, get the sample information which failed, try to recreate the same scenario which happened. If you're not able to find the same scenario, try different combinations of the scenario, identify when this issue happened, what time did it occur, or was there any similar operation which was done earlier or something like that, right? That's what I would suggest. If a web service is consuming two or other web services and we have to send the response within 30 seconds, and if these web services are not sending any responses, then how this scenario should be handled so that end user receives some response from our. Okay, so this is a very good question. So if you had seen my video on Hystrix does exactly the same thing. Hystrix is a circuit breaker design pattern where you can configure saying, okay, if this particular request is taking more than 30 seconds, go to my fallback. So you can send the end user saying my server is down, or the response is taking longer, please wait. If you had seen lots of websites, right, they do show up saying the response is taking longer than usual, please wait, or something like that. So these are circuit breaker design patterns. Do check out my video on Hystrix if you have not already. But if you didn't know that you can use Hystrix here, so this is a good example of how you can use Hystrix for a fallback mechanism, and you can configure the timeout as well based on your need. The next question is, what is reverse proxy? It's a very good question. So reverse proxy, in fact, in itself is a topic, but I'll just give you a brief overview, right? What is reverse proxy? Let's say you are working in a company, and you have all the applications deployed inside your network. You're talking with each application. You have different applications. You're talking inside each other. However, if somebody is from the external world or the internet is trying to access your application, they won't be able to, because there will be a firewall inside your company, right? Let's say you are going to use Google authentication for your application and you're trying to work on it. So previously you would have had an internal authentication. Now you're going to use Google authentication, which is outside your company, right? So this is when a reverse proxy is required. So every company has a reverse proxy which is hosted inside their company. So whenever you are trying to access a URL, right, it goes to that proxy and it identifies, okay, what type of URL it is, whether it is an internal URL or an external URL. If it is an internal URL, it just redirects inside its network. However, if it is an external URL, it has to redirect it to the internet, right? That is when reverse proxy is required. If somebody says you need to configure a reverse proxy, that basically means you will have to redirect all your requests outside your company to the internet, or outside the calling web service which is inside your company from the internet. So it can be other way around as well. So that is reverse proxy. So from your application perspective, it will be a seamless call, but from the network management perspective, it is doing a proxy which is nothing but reverse proxy. It is just reversing your request from your company network to the external world. So that is why it is called reverse proxy. So next question is load balancing in a clustered environment. Load balancing, if you had seen Google's website, right, the google.com. So if you type google.com, by default it gets redirected to google.co.in. So how do they do that? That is all based on load balancers. So they will be having different load balancers in different regions. That way they can redirect their request to a specific set of servers. So let's say you call it a cluster, right? So clustered environment. So imagine a clustered environment is nothing but a collection of servers, right? For example, let's say Flipkart, right? Flipkart is in India, so we just still type flipkart.in or flipkart.com. Imagine Flipkart has 10 different servers which are for showing up the UI part, right? Whatever you try in the UI, it's all hosted in 10 different servers. Now based on the number of requests, the request will be redirected to different servers. That is what the load balancer does. The URL for this particular machine is not hard coded or used by us directly. Instead we have something called flipkart.com, right? When you hit flipkart.com, it goes to a central load balancer, and that load balancer says, okay, it is flipkart.com/ui or something. I know that flipkart.com.ui should be redirected to a specific set of instances or a cluster, and since there are already these many requests in all these servers, I'll just redirect it to machine 4 or machine 5 or whatever. So the job of redirecting requests to specific set of servers based on the number of requests it is serving, that is what load balancer does. For example, Apache in itself has a load balancer. There is a load balancer called Nginx. So that is another load balancer. If you have multiple environments in production, you will be hitting one URL and it can go to any of these machines, right? So that is where load balancer comes into picture. So that is the load balancer. And why do we need load balancing? In order to reduce the resource allocation, every resource allocation to a single machine. And if you want to split these requests to multiple machines, that's when load balancers are useful. So those were the different questions which you guys had asked me. I hope I have answered to the best of my knowledge. So all these answers are like specific to my opinion. If I said something wrong, it could be wrong. Do let me know. I can correct it. Or there could be some cases like microservices and all. These are my opinions. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not saying that this is what you should be doing or something. But this is what I have learned and this is what I have experienced from my few years of corporate life, right? I hope you found this particular video interesting. If you have any questions, do drop that in the comment section below. I'll just get back to you. If you like the video, go ahead and like it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe to it. Meet you again in the next video. Thank you very much.